I believe, as populists have believed for a long time, that we should repudiate the national debt. Now, no politician is going to have the guts to do that, but this is banker debt. It's not people's debt. And I resent being myself and my family, my children and grandchildren, being saddled with this. It's again, this is all part of because of our counterfeit banking system.
Friends, before we begin this interview with author Don Jeffries, just a quick word from this interview's sponsor, Virtual Shield. In a recent news report, web browsers, Chrome, Firefox, and Safari are sending users browsing history and personal identifying information to external servers, and it's a worrisome trend. These three browsers were ranked in the lowest privacy category the study conducted. Chances are that you're using one of these browsers when you surf the internet. Imagine someone you don't know seeing what you search and when on a daily basis. And knowing where you live? Sounds creepy, right? This is why using Virtual Shield VPN is the recommended choice to help reduce any type of privacy risk. Here, let me show you how easy it is. You just go to virtualshield.com or the Google Play Store and download the Virtual Shield free 30-day trial, install it, and click Connect. Now that I'm connected, my IP address is one coming out of Chicago, and I don't live anywhere near Chicago, Illinois. It's March Madness month, and to celebrate, Virtual Shield is offering a special of 30% off all VPN plans and all premium add-ons. So sign up for a free 30-day trial to Virtual Shield VPN and see what the hype's about. You have nothing to lose and your privacy to keep. I'll leave the link below this video. Friends, it's so great to have you back. Thank you so much for tuning in. There is some blockbuster stuff I want to share in this interview with my good friend Don Jeffries. Don just wrote a book called Bullyocracy: How the Social Hierarchy Enables Bullies to Rule Schools, Workplaces, and Society at Large. We're going to talk in detail about the book at the end of this interview, but we're going to lead with some really profoundly important stuff. The economy and coronavirus, they're now inextricably connected in my view. On the line right now, my good friend Don Jeffries. How are you, Don?
Fine, Sean. Thanks for having me back.
I want to let people know about the book. It's a very important book because suicide rates are going off the charts with young people these days. Some of that can be attributed to bullying. You call it bullycide, I believe. And it's a huge, huge problem. So we're going to circle back and talk about the book. But first, let people know where they can get it.
Well, it's on Amazon. It's hopefully it'll be in some Barnes and Noble stores. This is a newer publisher for me, Trine Day, who publishes a lot of conspiracy books. But at the normal places you can find, you can Google it, and it's available, in all the usual outlets. There aren't very many brick and mortar stores left, so I would just say get your best deal you can online. And I never tell anybody to buy my books. I'm fine with you checking it out of the library. Just suggest to your library if they don't have it. Suggest that they order it, or suggest your college, whatever. The more places it gets into, the more hands it gets into, and that's all I'm interested in.
Well, that's awfully kind of you, but I would also advise people to try to support authors like you, because a lot of the truth that you share isn't coming from places like the Wall Street Journal. We'll get to that in a minute. So I'd advise people to, and they do, as you know, Donald, I have a very generous, kind audience. So I'm sure people will support you and buy this book because it is so important. As you know, we are under attack. Our families are under attack, be it from bullying or from opioids or from vaccines. There's so many different ways the powers that be harm us. And this bullying crisis is very, very important because it doesn't seem like very much is being done about it in the schools. So again, guys, we'll circle back to this at the end of the interview. Donald, I want to talk about the economy first, which is now inextricably linked to the coronavirus. The Fed is so panicked, and the powers that be are so scared that the American people will panic and that the global economy will slow to a crawl because of the supply chain problems in China. The Fed cut interest rates on Tuesday by 50 basis points, and the market did not go up. So where does this leave us? They're trying to stem the panic of coronavirus with paper.
Yeah, well, that's usually their answer for everything. And I look at this coronavirus, and I'm asked about it a lot. And I tend to be kind of in the minority, as I am in many issues, where I agree with essentially with John Rappaport's perspective. I think he's the expert on this subject. And we've seen this kind of, I call it fear porn and hysteria before, about SARS and Ebola, going back to the Hong Kong flu in the 1960s, swine flu, even AIDS. Most people don't remember how AIDS, the hysteria surrounding AIDS in the 1980s. As a young guy working back then, I was panicked that I was going to get it because working in a medical facility. I had Oprah Winfrey staring at the screen and issuing an Al Gore type ridiculous prediction of, three-quarters of America will have it by 1990 or some crazy statistic she threw out there. So I tend to think it's that, but we also know, as you are well aware of, that our leaders are largely eugenicists, and they have fantasized and talked openly about the need for culling the herd, for killing millions of people. And Bill Gates, who is probably the most psychopathic eugenicist of them all, he can't contain himself. He's overcome with glee by this. 33. I mean, of course, he used the number 33. That's so significant in Masonic circles. 33 million could die from this pandemic. So you never know. They've been talking about this for a long time. Will this happen? But one thing I agree with you on, that whatever this is, it's engineered. It's either an actual threat that was engineered in a lab, a super virus or whatever, or it's another elaborate hoax to try to create fear and panic amongst the public, maybe a little of both. But one thing I don't think there's any chance of is that it's just some random virus that got out of hand and escaped from monkeys or wherever they claim it came from, and now is threatening the world. I don't think there's any chance of that. So I hope that I'm right, to be not as alarmist as maybe some are in the conspiracy world. But you never know. One thing, they're not telling us the truth. And as someone who worked in the medical industrial complex my entire adult life, I saw what was going on behind the scenes there. I saw the sausage being made, and they're in charge of this. If this becomes a pandemic, they're going to be in charge. They're going to be the ones telling you to, get your shots, get your vaccines. And I don't trust them at all. I know how dishonest they are. And if you work behind the scenes, you know how incredibly bad most doctors are or can be, and healthcare providers are. They're not in the healthcare business. They're in the sick care business. And something like this has to have them drooling over the prospects, because this is a huge moneymaker for big pharma. If they can come up with a vaccine or delay it or whatever, you're talking about more bucks for them, and that's all they're interested in. So I don't trust anything they say, but we'll just have to wait and see. And I'm hoping that the John Rappaports of the world are right on this.
Well, here's the thing, and I want to share something that an email I received from a Wall Street Journal reporter on Monday. But before I do that, I just want to make the point that as those of us in the alternative news media cover this story, it's easy for some to accuse us of fear-mongering, but as we're going to get to in another soundbite I'm going to play here in a minute from author Adam Baratta, the author of The Great Devaluation, the coronavirus and the economy, again, as I've said, are now, I think, inextricably connected. And we were worried about an economic collapse prior to ever having this coronavirus COVID-19 come on the scene. So as we talk about whether or not this pandemic is engineered or not, it doesn't really matter if the R naught factor in this thing is 4 and it's highly infectious and it's killing people. Either way, it's out, and it is a danger to the global economy. So with that said, let me do another screen share. Donald, on Monday, I received this from Wall Street Journal, quote-unquote, reporter Sebastian Herrera, who wrote, I am a reporter at the Wall Street Journal. I'm writing about misinformation related to the coronavirus that is proliferating online. Part of what I plan to highlight is SGT Report publishing YouTube videos that, among other things, circulate unproven claims, such as that the virus is an engineered pandemic. Well, I've responded to Sebastian, and now I'm going to respond in more detail. Sebastian, there is zero evidence that the official story that you people peddle is true, that this virus somehow magically was born in a wet market in China. And now, for the benefit of Mr. Herrera and the audience, Donald, let me play this soundbite. Francis Boyle has been on the record now and explicitly stated that this thing is a bioweapon. It was weaponized.
So that is my conclusion, Spiro, that it leaked out of this lab. They were working on this turbocharged biological warfare agent for offensive uses. Some lab worker got infected. This routinely happens at BSL-3, BSL-4 labs. Did not realize the infection, went out, did his or her normal daily activities there in Wuhan for maybe 24 days, 14 days. It turns out right now the reported that's not adequate. Quarantine, 24 days is now the estimate. That comes from Yale. And at the end of 24 days, came down with a fever, reported to a hospital there. No one really figured out what was going on here for a while. And by then it was just too late.
The point I want to make is this: regardless of what John Rappaport thinks, or what you think, or what I think, or what the Wall Street Journal Herrera thinks, Donald, the bottom line is people should prepare, because to just believe this is a hoax and that it's not going to harm anybody and that the videos are fake coming out of Iran and China, to believe that, to take that advice, that's advice that could kill you.
Oh, well, sure, but it's always better to err on the side of caution. As I said, this is something they have talked about for a long time. Not necessarily a pandemic, but they've talked about the loss of millions of lives. They think there are too many people. We know that. That's what the eugenicists believe, and people like Bill Gates, Prince Philip. I mean, so many of these. I wrote about this in my earlier books. I had a whole chapter talking about eugenicists and how, so many, especially so-called liberals from the past, were eugenicists and talked about we need to cut down on the numbers of the population. So this is something that, and we know they also experiment. I mean, they've had, for unknown reasons, they've had the flu, the 1918 flu, which I killed millions of people all over the world. They still have a strain of that in a laboratory somewhere. So these people are Frankenstein types in many cases. You can actually picture them. I'm sure they could find people that would love to engineer a super pandemic type of thing. And as you mentioned, the economic, even if it turns out to be a big nothing burger, and like SARS or the swine flu or Ebola or whatever, even if that happens, and I'm right, the effect on the economy could be long term, and we've already seen those of us who have 401ks were devastated. What happened last week? Now it rallied yesterday, but as you notice, the Fed has cut interest rates now to incredibly low levels, and we may be in, as people have talked about, that we could end up with negative interest rates maybe at some point in the future. And these are all things we've never experienced before. So we don't know how this is going to affect us all economically. And as you and I both have believed for a long time, with the kind of economic system we have, with the way it's rigged in favor of the elite and the working class and the poor largely left out of the picture, at some point it seems like it has to collapse. But I've been saying that for a very long time. So maybe this will all come at one time, unfortunately, and we'll have a pandemic and an economic collapse to worry about. And I certainly hope that doesn't happen. But as you note, we should all try to be prepared. I have some supplies stocked up despite my hunch. And worst that can happen is you have a bunch of extra stuff, if you don't need it. But this is very, as I've said about other things, even before you throw something like a possible pandemic in there, that we're living in times that it would be a great science fiction movie, but unfortunately, we're not part of we're not characters we're involved in, and our lives are at stake. So let's hope. However you look at it, though, I don't have much confidence in anybody, in our leaders, because what has happened, and we saw this in things like Katrina, Puerto Rico, where they still may have some power out there. When we've had these kind of natural disasters that have happened since the birth of FEMA, the unconstitutional agency created under Carter, which is really there just for that purpose, we don't see the reaction that we should. And certainly Katrina was, criticized from all angles. It was just handled terribly. So with that incompetence factor there, if a real pandemic did occur, I don't have any trust. First of all, I don't trust the medical industrial complex or our leaders, and I don't have confidence in the people that would have to make the decisions, that they're just even competent enough, let alone corrupt.
Well, corrupt, you just nailed it right there. You mentioned Puerto Rico. I want to remind everybody that President Trump got tons of supplies to Puerto Rico.
Sitting in a warehouse.
And many of them were hidden in a warehouse because those in Puerto Rico wanted to make him look bad. And so they made the crisis worse by lying and hiding the supplies. Now, I'm worried that the same thing might happen here with the coronavirus in this country. If it's up to the Democrats, they're going to want things to get as bad as possible because they hate this president so much. It's hard to imagine that people could be so anti-American and anti-human, but I think that is potentially a problem. Now, while you were talking, I was playing some video that the BBC has also now shared. It's video coming out of Iran. And when I first posted it, there was no translation. Just a couple hours later, Donald, there was a translation, some of which is, quote, "All of these are the dead from the coronavirus. The situation is truly dreadful. May God show us some mercy," end quote. Donald, that was video coming out of Iran. Now we're hearing that the death count in Italy is even higher. This thing appears to be very real and spreading like wildfire, which brings me back to the economy. I want to play a soundbite for you from author Adam Baratta, author of The Great Devaluation. Listen to this.
Now, I want to highlight an asymptote, a deadly virus that has now become uncontainable. This is the debt of the United States. Can you identify the asymptotes? Donald Trump is on pace to double the debt of Obama, who doubled the debt of Bush, who doubled the debt of Clinton. What's alarming is that this has happened in what is widely being called the greatest economy in history. Last year, the United States ran a budget deficit of $1.2 trillion, which begs a very important question. If this is how we run our budgets in the very best of times, how big will our budget deficits become when things become less great?
I'll pause it right there, Donald. He says something very important.
Yeah, I actually heard it got louder as it went on, so I kind of heard most of it.
Oh, good, because he says if this is how we run our budgets in the very best of times, how do we run our budgets in the worst of times? And that's where we may be headed with coronavirus.
Yeah, well, it's the debt. When I hear about the debt, I get upset as the armchair economist that I am. That I believe, as populists have believed for a long time, that we should repudiate the national debt. Now, no politician is going to have the guts to do that, but this is banker debt. It's not people's debt, and I resent being myself and my family, my children and grandchildren, being saddled with this. It's again, this is all part of because of our counterfeit banking system, and because the Fed is allowed to monetize the debt. And I understand he's kind of talking more the conventional view. Yeah, it's completely out of control. But it's out of control because we don't know, because the Fed has never been audited. We don't really know that partial audit they had of the Feds, I don't know, 5-6 years ago. I think it was, it was trillions, I think, that they found in, corrupt laundering to other corporations and other banks. Who knows what's in there, what they're doing with this. But I don't think we should be signed on to this, and especially understanding how our fractional lending system works. That debt is largely imaginary because it was largely created out of these fractional loans, which are 90% or more created out of thin air, because you only have to have a 10% or less of actual reserves on hand. And of course, it's backed by nothing, by gold or silver or anything. And all the interest that we're forced to pay, or someone's forced to pay, is completely created out of thin air. So it's imaginary. So when they talk about these numbers, they seem, mind-boggling, and they're just going to keep growing. But, the Spotlight, the paper I write for now, American Free Press, when it was the Spotlight, they used to talk all the time about repudiating the debt. And I think that's what we need to do. And I don't expect anybody, I think if Donald Trump attempted to even broach that subject, I can't imagine the the furor that would arise from every corner of the establishment. But that's the only way. It's because we can't pay it off. I mean, by definition, any loan, even going outside our national debt, if you just tried to call in the loans, if all the creditors said, okay, well, we're calling in the loans, or the car loans, mortgages, everything that's out there, credit cards, because it's all based on that fractional system, there isn't enough money in circulation to pay those loans off. So that certainly stands even more so for something like the national debt. So, but I understand what he's talking about as far as something like a crisis like the coronavirus. Who knows how that's going to impact every aspect of our economy. But
well, think about it. Just think about what our economy is. It's what, a 70% service economy? Yeah. So if people stop going to restaurants, if people stop going to concerts, if people stop going to the movie theaters and sporting events, this thing could grind our economy to a halt. And you know what occurs to me as you talk about the debt, and we hear Adam Baratta talk about the debt? One thing the Islamic religion has right
Yes.
is to ban usury.
Yes.
It is the ultimate weapon of those that hate humanity. The ultimate weapon of these bankers, these Rothschilds, is usury. And they have done it. They've used it to ensnare humanity to unrepayable debt. And it should have been outlawed. It was outlawed at one point. You let these bankers in charge, and boy, sooner or later, they are going to buy up the entire economy, and they're going to own everything with debt they create out of thin air.
Absolutely. And, I was raised a Catholic, and the Catholic Church for centuries considered usury to be a mortal sin for a long time. Now, of course, that is, with the Vatican II and so forth, they've kind of crept into the mainstream here, and you don't hear much talk about that anymore. But anybody can recognize how awful this is. I remember back in the 90s, I think it was, when Steve Largent, the ex-NFL player, and some other Republican congressmen tried to hold hearings on just putting a cap on interest rates that credit card companies especially could charge. And the entire banking industry came after them. Steve Largent's political career was soon over. And you never heard any more about that. But we have to do something. And this all goes back, and that's why I write so much about history. And to my book, Crimes and Cover-Ups in American Politics, 1776, 1963, I talk about how all this began. And it began under what I consider one of the great villains of American history, Alexander Hamilton, who is now a hip black young Broadway star. And the only founding father that the establishment loves. And the reason they love him is because he's the father of debt. He's the one that started all this. He's the one that was fighting for a Federal Reserve type of entity back then. And it was him and Thomas Jefferson was my hero. That was the main argument in the early years of the Republic over, should we have a central bank or not? And basically the power of banks, where Jefferson didn't trust that. And Hamilton did. And obviously Hamilton's side won. Later we had Andrew Jackson fighting against the banks and so forth. But once the Federal Reserve was instituted in 1913, the battle was lost. But once the founding fathers went against their own good interests, and most of them understood, the Adamses, James Madison, certainly Thomas Jefferson understood how possibly corrupt it would be to allow these banks to have this kind of power over over the people. But they lost, because Alexander Hamilton, once he allowed the debts of the individual states after the American Revolution to be absorbed by the central government, that was the beginning of it all. And his side won. And most people don't know that or understand that, but you look at how exponentially that's grown since the late 1700s to where we are today. And it can never be paid off. So talking about it, I think, is just, I think we need to talk about it honestly, but unfortunately, very few people are willing to admit that, well, the debt that's out there is largely imaginary. The numbers are huge. They're astronomical, but you can't call it in. We can't pay off the debt because we don't have enough money in circulation, because most of it was created out of nothing.
That's right. And, as we're having this conversation, I'm thinking about the black swan event that everybody's been looking for so long. And it appears to me that this may be it. And as I think about COVID-19 in this economic debt bubble that we have, I'm reminded of Deagle.com, which I'm trying to call up right now as we're talking, and it's not loading, ironically. But do you remember the predictions from Deagle.com that were leaked a couple years back? And not even leaked, they published them on their websites, predicting a massive decline in population in the United States and in other Western nations. Do you remember that, Don?
I remember something about that, but then certainly lots of people have been, or at least the people in power have been wishing for it, but it wouldn't surprise me. I said, if this happens, and we've all kind of, just by virtue of what we write about and what we exposed about the incredible corruption, the diabolical nature, the satanic nature even of those that rule us, this is really something that's not beyond them. And they may just look at it again as a culling of the herd, to get rid of what Henry Kissinger, who's still alive, is the world's only 96-year-old obese man, is getting rid of the useless eaters, to use this term. And they may look at it, we need to come up with a figurative tsunami here to do what nature isn't doing. And because I think they look at these things in those kind of cold terms, because they don't have any morality. They're pro-death. They're not pro-life about anything. The things that they can sport obviously show that. So I don't think they would hesitate for a second to do this. And really, I've wondered for a long time why they keep talking about these things and they don't do it. And that's what kind of gives me hope, is that maybe it's some kind of bizarre thing where they just kind of like the shootings and the mass events we see. As people have told me when I think these things are hoaxes, well, why do you think that they would, that why wouldn't they just kill people? And yeah, certainly they don't hesitate to actually kill people. I just have to look at how these things, when you look at the evidence, what they appear to be. So in this case, certainly they wouldn't hesitate to do this. But is this just another one of their games? I don't know. It's this. There's a lot of weird symbolism and a strange mindset among our leadership, and I think it's something akin to where they have to talk about things before they do them, and almost like the vampire has to ask permission before to enter the house or something. They have a lot of strange elements to them, and I'm not sure. You see the way they play around with numbers and hand signs and all these things where they have to make it apparent to people. And of course, it doesn't matter how obvious they make it to most people. Most people are asleep and they're not going to notice it. But for the benefit of people like us, we can notice it, and maybe that's why they do it.
All right, we're going to talk about your new book, Bullyocracy, in just one second. But I just want to wrap up this portion of our interview with a message to Wall Street Journal, quote unquote, reporter Sebastian Herrera, a mercenary, a gun for hire. Mr. Herrera, shame on you for not telling people the truth. Shame on you for being a mockingbird for CFR powers, the shadow government, the people behind the real government that want to peddle their official narratives. You're messing with the wrong people here. Donald Jeffries is the author of Hidden History, an expose of modern crimes, conspiracies, and cover-ups in American politics. It's not conjecture. It's not hyperbole. It's quantifiable fact. The deep state that has been working against the people in this country has had too much power for far too long, and you serve them. Mr. Herrera, you serve them. I don't serve them, and Donald Jeffries doesn't serve them. So go ahead and write your hit piece, and you will only further hurt and destroy and damage the credibility of the Wall Street Journal among the people. The people are turning to the alternative news media in droves because they can see right through your lies. All right, Donald.
Well said.
Thank you. And before we turn to Bullyocracy, I just want to mention again your other book, Hidden History. It's a fantastic book. You are a premier JFK assassination researcher, and you recently got to ask Tulsi Gabbard a question about it. And I wanted to ask you about that. Don't you think that among all of the Democrats that were running for president, Tulsi Gabbard was the one they feared the most? Because not only was she a woman, she was a servicewoman, and she's in the military. She's sharp as a tack. And of course, the powers that be, including Hillary Clinton and the whole DNC apparatus, was turned against her, weaponized. And now you see they're all dropping out like flies to try to front run this thing for Biden. It's just pathetic.
Oh, it really is. And Tulsi Gabbard is somebody I was attracted to, mainly through her constant she has a lot of similarity to Ron Paul. In many ways, she's a Democratic version of Ron Paul. She's a civil libertarian. She's the only one that's spoken out for Julian Assange and Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning. No one else has. She's a co-sponsor of a bill to audit the Fed. We talked about that. She's consistently anti-war. She's against GMO foods. I mean, there's a lot of good things. There's some troubling aspects to as well. Apparently, a membership of the CFR. But nobody's perfect. But out of those Democrats, she's by far the best. So I was at a rally in my area. I was actually notified. I didn't know anything about it by one of my friends, Brian Lloyd, who was I couldn't believe was actually part of Roger Stone's defense team. So we talked a lot about that. I had him on my show last week talking about what he could talk about because of the gag order. But he's the one that filmed me. I got to ask her a question because I knew she had been reading JFK and the Unspeakable, which is a pro-conspiracy book written by James Douglas about the JFK assassination. And I asked her, I think she was taken aback, but I think she gave about as good an answer as we could have expected her to give. She said, I haven't finished the book, but what I've read so far, it seems to give, the best, words to that effect, the best explanation of what happened. So clearly, I think she's convinced there was a conspiracy to kill JFK, and she's the only, having studied the JFK assassination as long as I have, that's the first time in my lifetime that a presidential candidate has given an answer like that when asked. Invariably, even if behind the scenes we know, like Al Gore supposedly, was it Al Gore? I think it was Al Gore, and Bill Clinton even supposedly behind the scenes believed there was John Kerry. But when they were running for president, they wouldn't have answered that way. And when in fact, when they were asked, they would just typically tout the party line. So very happy to hear. I gave her a copy of my book, Survival of the Richest, and took a photograph of her holding it, me standing next to her. So she has no chance, of course. But and that's another feather in her cap, the fact that the media is ignoring her absolutely. And she's suing Google for messing with her search results.
Suing Hillary Clinton.
Suing Hillary Clinton for calling her a Russian. So she's got, like Trump, she has a lot of the right enemies. And I think there's some Trump derangement syndrome there too, because I know a lot of people that hate Trump that irrationally hate her. And it's the only Democrat they hate. And I think that's because when she voted president on impeachment, and she doesn't really attack Trump like the others do. She kind of goes forth with her own arguments for things, and I think that's really what candidates should do. So it was pretty cool. I was and the former Washington Post reporter Jefferson Morley got a hold of the story and wrote a story about me asking her the question, and it got some play on the internet. It was on Counterpunch and the Alternate, and so it was. I'm sure Tulsi Gabbard probably remembers my name now. I don't know if she likes it or not, but it probably got her a little more attention because I think a reporter was there from New York Magazine or something, and instantly went to one of these court historians, Larry Sabato, who wrote an Oswald Did It book, and asked him what he thought about it. And of course, he just kind of smeared her as a conspiracy person or whatever. So I don't know if she was happy that I was there asking her that question, but it was nice that I was able to do that.
You know what's so funny about the New World Order? These politicians, the Democratic Party, the DNC, stacking the deck again this time against Bernie. And I can't stand Bernie Sanders. I don't want him in the White House. But Joe Biden's a complete bumbling idiot, bought and paid for joke. So what kills me about these people is that their big magic trick, this whole idea of conspiracies are nonsense and you're a conspiracy theorist, so you shouldn't be listened to, that doesn't hold water with people anymore, because even people on the left recognize the fact that Hillary Clinton and the DNC stole the nomination from Bernie this last time around, and people are fed up with the corruption. People know that Biden told the CFR, he bragged about the bribery going on there, the quid pro quo, so that fire the prosecutor who's investigating Burisma and essentially his son, Hunter. People know that. People are waking up in droves. So Wall Street Journal Mockingbird reporters like Sebastian Herrera don't stand a chance, because at the end of the day, truth wins. Truth outs, Donald. So I guess that's the good news. I just can't imagine, though, them stacking the deck to try to get Biden. I cannot imagine a debate between bumbling, sleepy, creepy Joe Biden and President Trump. I mean, the guy is now, he's going around and he's stumbling. He doesn't know which city he's in. He doesn't know which office he's running for. He says, I'm probably running for the U.S. Senate. The guy is losing his marbles. And that's the best. That's the guy they want to prop up. It's just crazy.
He's preparing for Super Thursday today. Yeah, the Democrats appear to have a suicide wish, because they should be able to tap into all the hatred for Trump that's out there and at least make it a close race. But I think their two best candidates they had, in terms of message and in terms of just demeanor, were Tulsi Gabbard and Andrew Yang. I think Andrew Yang had a lot of impressive things about him, and they ignored them. They certainly smeared Tulsi a lot, and they went for these awful. I mean, there's the rest of them. Bernie is the best of that bunch. I mean, he's the one that draws the crowds, and you know what he is. And so, yeah, it's kind of amazing, because I think that I don't see how Trump can possibly lose at this point, but who knows? I mean, I didn't think he could possibly win in 2016. So
right.
We'll have to see. And as you said, whatever happens with the coronavirus, that could have a huge impact on what happens.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, again, it's not fear-mongering to talk about the economic dangers, to talk about the insurmountable debt bubble, and to talk about what now appears to be a pandemic spreading across the globe. That's not fear-mongering. It's called news. It's called reporting about what's happening. And what we try to do here at SGT Report is get to the facts of the matter. And with that said, I want to turn my attention to your book, BULLYOCRACY, How the Social Hierarchy Enables Bullies to Rule Schools, Workplaces, and Society at Large. You begin with a fantastic quote from Kurt Vonnegut, and it really speaks to these people, these Democrats really in the DNC, and the people that have risen to power. People like Debbie Wasserman Schultz. I despise her. And as you listen to this quote, think of these creepy Democrats that want power. Kurt says, quote, "True terror is to wake up one morning and discover that your high school class is running the country," end quote. Don, your new book, BULLYOCRACY, what compelled you to write it?
Well, a lot of people have asked me that, and I think I dedicated the book to my niece who was born with Down syndrome when I was about 11. That had a huge impact on me because I started seeing the world in very different terms. Up till that point, I was a little kid that said retard sometimes, and I felt, in some ways, I felt guilty that I had been saying that word, and maybe this is punishment or something. And when I saw how she was treated by even so-called respectable adults, I was flabbergasted. I couldn't believe that people could be that cruel. So if people have someone that they love that are different, that are born with something really challenging like that, you have to have a different perspective on things. Now, so many people that have been blessed and all their children and close family members are so-called normal and high achievers, and they're the ones that you see being very callous often towards people that are challenged, and they think maybe they have superior genes or something. But that had a huge impact on me. And my brother also went through a very difficult experience in high school where it was kind of a bullying thing on steroids, where there was a huge overreaction to a very small offense he did, and his world just kind of plummeted out of control. He was bullied thereafter. He was forced to go to another school. He's never been the same since. And so I can see like one impact in my life, something that was just taken out of control by there was a general involved. The girl's father was a powerful general. And I saw how the machinery, even at 7 years old, I saw as a kid. And I think that's where my distrust of the legal system and my hostility towards the rich and powerful came from that incident. I saw how it could impact the family. So I think that's the only thing I can figure why I became, because I wasn't bullied myself, but my kids weren't. But I just always have had tremendous empathy for those that were. I've never understood it. And, everything I do is hopefully is trying to expose some kind of corruption or injustice. And I'm always fighting for the little guy. And in this case, I think the little guy are these countless numbers of victims of bullying. And what really impresses me is talking, if those are interested, I hope they check out the book, but I hope they look at my blog too, donaldjeffries.wordpress.com. And my blog entry I wrote yesterday, I included the story of a 72-year-old woman who has been emailing me back and forth and wants to be anonymous, it's so incredible I had to put it by itself. I mean, this is a person who had polio as a child and was kicked in her polio legs by people. But the thing that really got my attention is when she graduated when she was in her senior year in high school, she was called up on stage to get an award. And her mother and grandmother came there because she had never gotten an award before. So proud. The principal of the school gave her an award for the most unlikely to succeed in front of the entire student body, and then went on. Everybody laughed, and that's what this book talks about. Is that so? The teachers, and it's not going to be popular, obviously, with schools, because I'm the first one to say all these so-called anti-bullying efforts and bully-free zones are by so-called anti-bullying activists and people that are concerned that want to work with the schools. And as I point out in the book, the schools are the problem. That's the problem, because you can't work with the schools, because I've talked to parents, several parents whose kids killed themselves. One was as young as 11 years old, who hung himself in the nurse's office at school. And somehow nobody noticed or heard that and allowed that to happen. But these are all kids that were bullied, and their parents had gone to the teachers. They had gone to the administration, the principals, even school superintendents, law enforcement, media. They all were indifferent to it. They all did nothing. In some cases, they'll go dozens of times or more. They have the bullies' names. They say, look, this has got to stop, and they just won't. The only time that the school machinery seems to react is when the bullied victim finally fights back. And at that point, suddenly they notice, and they usually punish the victim more than they punished, if they've even punished the bully at all. So there's so many stories in this book, but people are not going to believe it. They're really not. But this is all true. These are all, I've talked to many of these people, and it's astonishing. And I believe, my thesis is, that's why I talk about the social hierarchy. I believe it gets into the theory of popularity and unpopularity. And what we found in recent studies have shown that, people have thought in the past that, well, these bullies are troubled youth. They're going to probably get turned to a life of crime. Maybe they come from broken homes. Maybe they're getting beaten themselves. No, that's largely not the case. Most bullies are popular. And it's a bullying of the popular, the jocks, and the girls, the mean girls, the real pretty girls that we see. That's where the bullying really, and that's the stuff that's really covered up. In the unlikely case, maybe that somebody from a broken home is doing that and isn't popular, then they are liable probably to be punished. But the bullying that you see covered up is because so many times football players, I mean, raping girls, I mean, it's happened over and over again. I have lots of the cases in there, and the communities even support the football players over the, whether it's in one case, it was a special needs girl that was, I don't know what her challenge was, but she had something going on. A group of football players raped her, and the community defended them. They all took their side. Why are you, we have a powerful team. And so much of this is hooked up with sports. And also the fact that, as Kurt Vonnegut's quote said, that, the people that were in your high school running things, well, he didn't address the social hierarchy there. But what I found, and I have a section in the book where I looked into the backgrounds of the movers and shakers of our society, as many as I could, politicians, entertainers, business leaders. Almost to the vast majority of them were popular in high school. They were either big athletes, cheerleaders. So many of the high profile women, I mean, the vast majority of them were cheerleaders, especially newscasters, where it actually makes sense because they're basically in their jobs, they're now cheerleaders for the state. So they're a natural because they were cheerleaders in high school. So they're good at what they do, rah, rah, go deep state, they're good at that. But, so we're being ruled basically by the popular kids, and you have outliers like Bill Gates that weren't, but so many people wouldn't suspect. For instance, Rosie O'Donnell was her homecoming queen. Pee Wee Herman was a high school wrestler. Woody Allen was a great basketball and baseball player in high school. Joe Biden, big college football star. So many of these that people wouldn't believe. Even Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a high school cheerleader. I mean, it goes, and it's. I think that is why the social hierarchy, because it rules society. And we see, I have a whole section in there how we have workplace bullying, where you have bully bosses because the guy that that tortured somebody, that 70-year-old woman, the kids that kicked her in her legs when she had polio, they went on to work somewhere.
Well, how about Bloomberg? It sounds like Bloomberg has been a bully in the workplace pretty much his whole life, and now he's running for president, and he's a billionaire.
Oh, he's got that absolute. He certainly has that attitude. He certainly seems to be hostile towards everyone. Then you throw that kind of money in there, it enables you obviously to be even more punitive towards those that you don't like. But when we're working with people, you see, okay, the guy in the cubicle across the street, he may have been one of those who kicked a girl with polio on her legs. He may have been one of those that we see, and especially with the birth of the internet, cyberbullying is so powerful. I mean,
that's what I want to ask you about. I've been waiting to ask you about this. So I'm going to do a screen share in a second, and I want to share a personal story just real briefly. So people know that two of our sons were adversely affected by vaccines. I've talked about that a lot, and I don't want to get too specific, but we've struggled for a very long time with our oldest son. And those of you out there that are closest to me, a few of you know some really hard, painful details about this, but my son was diagnosed as a little guy around age 5 or 6 with what was called a nonverbal processing disorder. Now, back then in the early 2000s, autism wasn't really talked about. Asperger's wasn't really talked about. The spectrum was something people were just starting to have to deal with. And so he's on the spectrum. And when he was in high school, because he had a difficult time with relationships, I'd get an email, my wife would get an email from a teacher, a kind teacher, who would try to befriend him and say, hey, I tried to invite your son in to eat lunch with me because he eats his lunch in the hallway alone, which just breaks your heart in a school with more than 2,000 students. So this has only gotten worse over time because of his struggle making friends and having lasting, meaningful relationships because of his processing disorder. It breaks my heart for these kids out there who are struggling because of damage potentially from vaccines, because of issues due to being the targets of essentially bioweapons. That's what I call the vaccine program. They're chemical weapons delivery systems, and they're making this worse because we're seeing anxiety rates off the charts, depression off the charts among teenagers. And in addition to that, sadly, Donald, we're seeing teen suicide rates off the charts, up 56% in just the past decade. Now suicide is the second leading cause of death for older teens and young adults. The suicide rate has been increasing from 2007 to 2017, Donald. And to me, it speaks perhaps to the issue with vaccines and causing problems with kids and families, number one. But number two, we didn't have social media when you and I were growing up. There was no Snapchat. There was no Instagram. There was no YouTube. There was no way to feel left out when you're tuning in to watch what everybody else is doing. And then if you're being bullied online, socially, you may be in your bedroom on your phone as a teenager getting bullied to death, and your parents have no idea it's going on. It's very, very sad, and it's really become an epidemic.
Absolutely, and you're right about because so many of the cases that I recount in the book, they're the people who are on the autism spectrum, and that's an increasing number of kids. It's amazing how this is, how this cannot be tied to vaccines, because we don't see anything else that really has changed other than the number of vaccines and what's put in those vaccines. It's been happening since certainly my kids were little. And, tons of their friends are on the spectrum in one degree or another, and apparently it's getting worse. And it gives bullies, and again, that's the personality that's there, it gives those that have power. And popularity is what gives people power in school, much as success gives people power in life. And there's a correlation between popularity and success. And if you have that power and you're going to lord it over the weakest foes, and, much as they would go after fat kids or kids with braces or freckles or whatever, some kind of deformity that they could, a bad haircut, I don't know, glasses, anything in the past. Now they have something more powerful because depending on how severe, if you have Asperger's, maybe not so much, but if you're farther on the autism spectrum where you have trouble talking or you can't process things or whatever, you can't interact socially, it gives bullies a real weapon. And lots of the cases are especially tragic in the book because they do involve special needs students, and they also include in many cases, teachers bullying special needs students. And that's what is really different about my book, because I call out the bully teachers. And in the case of the 72-year-old woman, that was a bully principal that was involved in humiliating her and an entire school and scarring her for life. And that's why I think it's important to expose these things, because there are middle-aged people out there, Sean. I read the heartbreaking accounts on the forum when I was writing on forums when I was writing this book that are still trying to process these things decades afterwards. And in many cases, they were not able to lead normal lives. They never married. They didn't have children. They became antisocial because they were scared to interact with people, because the only way they knew was to be a victim, because they were so used to being bullied. They were cowed into this submissiveness. They were unable to succeed at work too, because that those scars were. That's why the cover of the book, I was indebted to Rich Johnson, a photographer who had a special project where he filmed all these faces with the visible scars, because these emotional scars aren't visible, but they leave just as much of an impact. And if you mentioned cyberbullying, it's very, very distressful. If you look at all the teenage girls especially that have killed themselves in recent years, it's amazing how gorgeous many of them are. They're really good-looking kids, and you never saw that back in my day. That would have never happened. But it's because of the mean girl phenomenon, the cyberbullying, where they're in cliques with other pretty girls. And for whatever reason, they're the ones that the rest of them gang up on. They can't handle it in the end of their lives, and it's tragic. But until we look at it the right way, if you don't call out the social hierarchy, it's never going to change. And the worst part of this writing this book was discovering that almost all of the anti-bullying groups were in fact taking up for the bullies. And I describe all of it in the book. I've had interactions with him, and actually since the book has been published, I'm discovering that there's a resistance there on big so-called anti-bullying groups, or I can't get them interested in the book. And this should be the book they've been waiting for, but I suspect it's because they can tell by the subtitle, The Social Hierarchy, where I'm going with it, and they don't want to go there. But until they go there, nothing's going to happen, because the highest rates of bullying are at those schools that advertise the no bully, the zero tolerance. And we see that in the workplace as well, where you see whistleblowers. I mean, there's a fine line between this and whistleblowers that where they come forth and they're essentially bullied. I mean, in the case of someone like Snowden or Manning or Assange, they're bullied to the nth degree where they could be put in prison. But workplace bullies, generally speaking, are usually targeted for retaliation. And this happens with police officers, firefighters, lots of these occupations, medical field, where they come forth and blow the whistle on what they're seeing and the behavior of some of their peers, and they're retaliated against, even though they're, much as the schools advertise a no bully, zero tolerance and so forth, the same way in these workplaces where they say, you know, we want you to report wrongdoing. You know, we value whistleblowers, much as Barack Obama talked about how much he valued whistleblowers, and he locked up more whistleblowers than anybody in history. That's the way most workplaces operate, unfortunately. And we have to face the fact that the psychopathic, we talked about Bill Gates, the psychopathic traits, I have a study in a book from England there, where it went over the occupations that have the highest rates of psychopathic traits of the people that are in those fields. And they're all the most successful fields: doctors, lawyers, clergymen, CEOs, entertainers. These are the people that are doing the things we all want to do, athletes, of course. And those psychopathic traits are essential to their bullying traits. So we have an expression in this country, nice guys finish last, and no one questions it.
Yeah.
Because they know it's true. And that's a sad commentary on our society.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned whistleblowers, and of course the high profile ones like Assange and Snowden. That's one aspect of this thing. But how about the bullies at places like Google that punish whistleblowers like Zach Voorhees and James Damore for writing a paper? He merely wrote a paper, and he got fired because he wasn't being woke enough. So I think as we round out this conversation, I would like to recommend that everybody listening who's a parent should buy this book, and anybody who's listening who knows a teacher should perhaps buy this book and gift it to that teacher. I think it's very important that teachers wake up to this problem and find empathy to intervene whenever they can, wherever they see bullying. Donald, hey, I really appreciate your time today, and thank you for sending me a copy of the book.
Oh, thanks for having me, Sean. It's always a pleasure. Anytime you want me, I'm there.
All right, brother. And just to remind people, Amazon, that's the best place to find Bullyocracy?
Well, anywhere. You know, I don't like Amazon, but I usually leave their links because it's, as a writer who's constantly writing, I like to have as many ratings as I can, reviews, and that's the only way to judge how your book is doing, because they have a sales ranking there. So that's why, the only reason I go there, you get the best deal you can. You can may be able to find it cheap, although Amazon does do these kind of flash sales where if you catch it at the right time, they cut the price on everything just for very brief periods of time. So I have no control over it. But get the best deal you can. I look for, it's available everywhere, Barnes & Noble and the Books A Million, all the stores and places that are there. But look for the best deal that you can. The important thing is that you read it and spread the word if you can.
All right, very good. Guys, our guest has been Donald Jeffries. He's the author of Hidden History, Bullyocracy, and 3 other great books. You can find them all online. Donald, thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Sean.
All right, thank you. And guys, thank you so much. A shout out to my patrons who are keeping us in the fight for truth. Yes, Anderson Cooper gets paid $12 million a year to lie. I don't know what Sebastian Herrera gets paid over at the Wall Street Journal, but he's a mercenary for hire, and he's taken a check to lie, in my view. And we stand in opposition to those in the Mockingbird mainstream media. So for real news 24/7, guys, you can visit us directly at sgtreport.com, the antidote to corporate propaganda and Mockingbird mainstream media lies. God bless. Bye-bye.
You said it earlier. This is something that never happened in the history of mankind. You can compare this virus to different viruses, but we've never seen anything where we shut down, and it's not 50 million people, it's 500 million people in China.